Sheriff Brody had seen a lot in his years of service. He'd faced down criminals, comforted victims, and always tried to uphold the law, even when it was difficult. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the battles he knew he was about to face in suburban hell, otherwise known as the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The sign outside the Willow Creek development boasted luxury living, but Brody suspected luxury tyranny was more accurate. He glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter, Lily, happily humming along to her favorite pop song. Lily, bright and full of life, despite being confined to a wheelchair due to a childhood illness, deserved a fresh start. That's why he'd taken this job, moved them both here. He wanted her to have a safe, peaceful place to call home. He just hoped this wasn't a mistake. Willow Creek was pristine. Every lawn was perfectly manicured, every house painted in approved shades of beige, every shrub trimmed with military precision. It was the kind of place where a single dandelion could spark a neighborhood-wide crisis. Brody already felt a headache brewing. He pulled into the driveway of their new house, a modest two-story with a small, but manageable, yard. Lily gasped with delight. "It's perfect, Dad," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling. "I can already see where I'm going to put the Halloween decorations." Brody smiled. Lily loved holidays, and decorating was her passion. It brought her so much joy. He helped her out of the car and into her wheelchair, carefully maneuvering her up the ramp he'd had installed. As they rolled onto the porch, a woman appeared seemingly out of nowhere. She was tall and thin, with a severe haircut and a permanent frown etched on her face. She wore a crisp pantsuit and carried a clipboard. This had to be Mrs. Kravitz. "You must be the new residents," she said, her voice sharp and disapproving. "I'm Patricia Kravitz, president of the HOA. I trust you've read the bylaws." Brody nodded, already bracing himself. "Yes, ma'am. We have." Mrs. Kravitz's gaze swept over Lily, lingering on her wheelchair, then on the small, inflatable pumpkin Lily had brought with her. "Well, let's hope you understand the importance of maintaining our community's standards. We have very specific rules about decorations, landscaping, and general appearance." Her tone implied Lily's general appearance was already a problem. Brody's hand clenched into a fist. This was going to be a long 60 minutes, and maybe longer if he didn't keep his cool. Brody's instincts screamed that Mrs. Kravitz was going to be a problem. He'd dealt with difficult people before, but there was something particularly rigid about her. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that he was a professional. He could handle this. "Well, Mrs. Kravitz," Brody said, forcing a smile. "We're looking forward to being part of the community. We're eager to get settled in." "Settled, yes," she replied, her eyes still fixed on Lily's pumpkin. "But not overzealous. We have very specific guidelines regarding holiday decorations. They must be tasteful, understated, and removed promptly after the holiday. No inflatable Santas on the roof, no flashing lights, and absolutely no ghastly displays." Brody bit back a retort. He knew what she was implying. Lily's decorations weren't just decorations, they were an expression of her joy, a way for her to connect with the world when so much felt out of reach. "We'll keep that in mind," he said evenly. Mrs. Kravitz nodded curtly. "See that you do. And the landscaping, the grass must be kept at precisely 2 inches, no weeds allowed, and only approved plants are permitted. A list is included in the bylaws." She tapped the clipboard ominously. "We take these matters very seriously." As Mrs. Kravitz droned on about the HOA's endless list of rules and regulations, Brody's gaze swept over the neighborhood again. It was undeniably beautiful, in a sterile, artificial way. Every house looked exactly the same, every lawn a perfect replica of the one next door. There was no individuality, no character, no life. He noticed a few other neighbors peeking out from behind their curtains, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They seemed to be watching the interaction with bated breath, as if afraid to draw Mrs. Kravitz's attention to themselves. Brody realized this wasn't just about perfectly manicured lawns and tasteful decorations. It was about control. Mrs. Kravitz wielded her power like a weapon, enforcing the HOA's rules with an iron fist and stifling any hint of individuality or dissent. He made a silent vow, he wouldn't let her do that to Lily. He wouldn't let her crush his daughter's spirit with her petty rules and regulations. He was the county sheriff, and he knew a thing or two about fighting for what was right. This wasn't just about decorations, it was about protecting his daughter and ensuring she had the happy, fulfilling life she deserved. He knew, deep down, that this was going to be a battle, but he was ready to fight. For Lily, he was ready for war. The first week flew by in a flurry of unpacking and settling in. Lily, despite the mountains of boxes, was already planning her Halloween extravaganza. She'd sketched out elaborate designs for spooky ghosts, grinning pumpkins, and friendly monsters, all wheelchair accessible, of course. Brody helped her hang a few simple decorations, a string of orange lights around the porch railing and a friendly ghost hanging from the door. Nothing too extravagant, he thought, just enough to add a touch of cheer. Then came October 1st, Lily, with Brody's help, began to unleash her creative vision. She carefully arranged a collection of inflatable pumpkins of various sizes on the lawn. She hung a large, sparkly spiderweb from the porch roof, complete with a giant, fuzzy spider. She even set up a motion-activated skeleton that popped out of a coffin, cackling gleefully. Brody watched, his heart swelling with pride. Lily's face glowed with happiness as she surveyed her handiwork. "It's perfect, Dad," she exclaimed, clapping her hands. "The best Halloween ever." He knew Mrs. Kravitz wouldn't see it that way. Sure enough, later that afternoon, as Lily and Brody were enjoying a cup of hot cocoa on the porch, Mrs. Kravitz marched across the lawn, her face a mask of disapproval. She stopped directly in front of their house, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Mr. Brody," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm afraid I must insist that you remove these excessive decorations immediately." Lily's face fell. Her eyes, which had been sparkling just moments before, clouded over with disappointment. Brody's protective instincts kicked into high gear. "Excessive?" Brody asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I think they're quite festive. The kids in the neighborhood seem to enjoy them." He had, in fact, seen several children stop to admire Lily's display, their faces lit up with smiles. "Festive, perhaps," Mrs. Kravitz sniffed. "But certainly not in keeping with the community's standards. They're gaudy, ostentatious, and frankly, an eyesore. They detract from the overall aesthetic of Willow Creek." Brody took a deep breath. He knew this was coming, but it still stung. He glanced at Lily, who was now staring at the ground, her shoulders slumped. He had to say something. He had to stand up for her. "Mrs. Kravitz," he began, his voice firm but polite. "With all due respect, I believe my daughter's decorations are harmless and bring joy to the neighborhood. I don't see how they're hurting anyone." Mrs. Kravitz's eyes narrowed. "It's not about hurting anyone, Mr. Brody. It's about following the rules. And the rules clearly state that decorations must be tasteful and understated. This display is anything but." The stage was set for a showdown. Brody knelt beside Lily, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. He could feel her trembling slightly. He knew how much these decorations meant to her. "Mrs. Kravitz," Brody said, his voice now laced with steel. "My daughter has a disability. Decorating for the holidays is one of the few things that brings her real joy. It allows her to express her creativity and connect with the community. I'm not going to take that away from her." Mrs. Kravitz's expression hardened. "I'm sorry about your daughter's condition," she said, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "But that doesn't give her the right to disregard the rules. Everyone in this community is expected to abide by the same standards." "But what harm are they causing?" Brody persisted. They're not blocking the sidewalk, they're not making excessive noise, they're not disrupting anyone. They're just decorations. They're setting a bad example, Mrs. Kravitz retorted. If we allow one person to disregard the rules, everyone will. Soon, the entire neighborhood will be overrun with tacky decorations and overgrown lawns. We can't allow that to happen. Brody sighed. He realized he wasn't going to get through to her with logic or reason. Mrs. Kravitz was determined to enforce her vision of suburban perfection, regardless of the human cost. Mrs. Kravitz, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I understand that you're the president of the HOA, and I respect that. But I'm also a father, and I'm not going to let you bully my daughter. These decorations are staying. Mrs. Kravitz's face turned red with anger. You can't do that, she sputtered. I'll have the HOA fine you. I'll have your decorations removed. I'll make your life a living hell. Brody stood up, towering over Mrs. Kravitz. You can try, he said, his eyes narrowed. But I wouldn't advise it. He knew he was escalating the situation, but he couldn't help himself. He wasn't going to let this woman push him around, especially when it came to his daughter. Lily, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Her voice was small, but firm. Dad, it's okay, she said. Maybe we should just take them down. Brody looked at Lily, his heart breaking. He saw the disappointment in her eyes, the resignation in her voice. He knew she was trying to protect him, but he couldn't let her give in. No, Lily, he said, squeezing her hand. We're not taking them down. We're going to fight for our right to decorate our own home. He looked back at Mrs. Kravitz, his gaze unwavering. This isn't over. He knew it was just the beginning. The battle lines were drawn. That night, Brody lay awake, replaying the confrontation in his mind. He knew he'd handled it poorly, letting his emotions get the better of him. He should have remained calm, tried to reason with Mrs. Kravitz, perhaps even offered to compromise. But seeing the disappointment on Lily's face had pushed him over the edge. The next morning, he decided to try a different approach. He baked a batch of Lily's favorite chocolate chip cookies and, with Lily by his side, walked over to Mrs. Kravitz's house. Mrs. Kravitz answered the door, her face a mask of suspicion. What do you want? She demanded, her eyes narrowing as she took in the plate of cookies. Good morning, Mrs. Kravitz, Brody said, forcing a smile. We just wanted to apologize for the disagreement yesterday. We were hoping we could talk things over. Mrs. Kravitz hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly opened the door wider. Come in, she said, her voice still cold. Brody and Lily entered the house, which was even more meticulously decorated than he had imagined. Everything was perfectly arranged, every surface gleaming. It felt more like a museum than a home. Please, sit, Mrs. Kravitz said, gesturing to a pair of stiff-backed chairs in the living room. Brody and Lily sat down, and Brody placed the plate of cookies on the coffee table. We brought these as a peace offering, he said. Lily made them herself. Mrs. Kravitz eyed the cookies with suspicion but didn't touch them. I appreciate the gesture, she said. But it doesn't change the fact that your decorations are in violation of the HOA rules. I understand that, Brody said. But I was hoping you could make an exception, just this once. My daughter, Lily, has a disability. She's been through a lot in her life, and decorating for the holidays is one of the few things that truly makes her happy. It's a way for her to express herself and feel like she's part of the community. He looked at Lily, who was sitting quietly beside him, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Kravitz. It would mean the world to her if you would just let her keep the decorations up, Brody finished. Mrs. Kravitz was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Brody held his breath, hoping that his words had reached her. Finally, she spoke. I understand that your daughter has a disability, she said, her voice softening slightly. But the rules are the rules. I can't make an exception for one person without making an exception for everyone. If I let you keep your decorations up, then everyone else will want to do the same. And then where would we be? Brody's heart sank. He knew he had failed. He had tried to reason with Mrs. Kravitz, to appeal to her sense of compassion, but it was no use. She was too rigid, too inflexible, too determined to enforce her vision of suburban perfection. I see, Brody said, his voice flat. Well, thank you for your time, Mrs. Kravitz. He stood up, and Lily followed suit. As they turned to leave, Lily spoke up, her voice filled with disappointment. Thank you for listening, she said quietly. Mrs. Kravitz didn't respond. She simply stood there, watching them leave, her face a mask of cold indifference. Brody knew then that this wasn't just about decorations. It was about something much deeper, something much more sinister. And he had a feeling that this was far from over. The following days were filled with tension. Mrs. Kravitz seemed to be everywhere, constantly monitoring their property, scrutinizing every detail. Brody found a formal notice of HOA violation taped to their door, citing the decorations, the slightly overgrown grass, it was barely longer than 2 inches, and even a rogue dandelion that had dared to sprout near the mailbox. But the worst was yet to come. One afternoon, Lily was outside, adding a new touch to her Halloween display, a hand-painted sign that read, Happy Halloween. Wheelchair accessible trick-or-treating here. She was beaming with pride, excited to welcome trick-or-treaters to their home. Brody was inside, working on some paperwork, when he heard Lily cry out. He raced outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Lily sitting in her wheelchair, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Kravitz stood over her, her face contorted with anger. What's going on here? Brody demanded, his voice trembling with rage. I was just trying to explain to your daughter the importance of following the rules, Mrs. Kravitz said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But I don't think she understands. Perhaps she's not capable of understanding. Brody's blood boiled. He knew exactly what Mrs. Kravitz was implying. What did you say to her? Brody asked, his voice low and dangerous. I just said that maybe if she wasn't burdened by her condition, Mrs. Kravitz continued, her gaze fixed on Lily, she would be able to appreciate the importance of maintaining a beautiful community. Lily began to cry, her small body shaking with sobs. Brody knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her protectively. Don't listen to her, Lily, Brody said, his voice filled with love and anger. She's just a mean, unhappy person who's trying to make you feel bad. But you're amazing, and your decorations are beautiful, and you have nothing to be ashamed of. Mrs. Kravitz scoffed. Oh, please, she said. Don't try to turn this into some sob story. Your daughter's condition is her problem, not mine. And it certainly doesn't give her the right to ruin the aesthetic of our community. You're disgusting, Brody said, his voice shaking with fury. You're a cruel, heartless woman who has no compassion for others. I can't believe you would say such horrible things to a child, especially a child with a disability. Mrs. Kravitz simply shrugged. I'm just being honest, she said. Someone has to tell her the truth. She needs to understand that she's different, and that she needs to adjust her expectations accordingly. Brody couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never encountered such blatant cruelty and prejudice in his life. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. He was trapped, caught between his desire to protect his daughter and his commitment to upholding the law. But he knew, deep down, that he wouldn't let Mrs. Kravitz get away with this. He would find a way to stop her, no matter what it took. He had to. For Lily. Brody scooped Lily up in his arms and carried her inside, his anger simmering just below the surface. He settled her on the couch and grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around her shivering body. It's okay, sweetie, he said, stroking her hair. She's gone now. She can't hurt you. But Lily continued to sob, her body racked with tremors. She's mean, Dad, she cried. She hates me. She doesn't hate you, Lily, Brody said, trying to reassure her, even though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. She's just a sad, angry woman who's trying to take her anger out on you. But you're not going to let her do that, are you? Lily shook her head, her tears still flowing. Suddenly, Brody noticed something strange. Lily was staring at her stomach, her eyes wide with fear. What's wrong, honey? Brody asked, his voice filled with concern. Fire, Lily whispered, pointing to her stomach. Fire on me. Brody looked down and saw a small, red dot dancing on Lily's shirt. He followed the dot with his eyes and saw it originating from Mrs. Kravitz's house across the street. He squinted and saw Mrs. Kravitz standing at her window, holding something in her hand. Brody realized what was happening. Mrs. Kravitz was using a laser pointer, shining the red dot on Lily's stomach. His anger exploded. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Kravitz would stoop so low, that she would deliberately try to scare and intimidate his daughter. He stormed out of the house and across the street, his fists clenched. He marched up to Mrs. Kravitz's front door and banged on it with all his might. Mrs. Kravitz opened the door, her face a mask of false innocence. What do you want now? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You know damn well what I want, Brody said, his voice shaking with rage. What the hell do you think you're doing, shining that laser pointer on my daughter? Mrs. Kravitz feigned ignorance. Laser pointer? I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Brody said, stepping closer to her. I saw you. I saw you standing at your window, pointing that thing at Lily. What were you trying to do, scare her? Mrs. Kravitz shrugged. Maybe I was just trying to teach her a lesson, she said, her eyes glinting with malice. Maybe I was just trying to show her what happens to people who don't follow the rules. Brody's rage reached a boiling point. He wanted to grab Mrs. Kravitz and shake her until her teeth rattled, but he knew he couldn't. He was a sheriff, and he had to uphold the law, even when he wanted to break it. You're sick, Brody said, his voice trembling with anger. You're a sick, twisted woman who needs help. Mrs. Kravitz simply smiled. Maybe I am, she said. But I'm also the president of the HOA, and I have the power to make your life a living hell. That was the last straw. Brody had reached his breaking point. He knew he couldn't let Mrs. Kravitz continue to terrorize his daughter. He had to do something, and he had to do it now. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his sheriff's badge. That's enough, Mrs. Kravitz, he said, his voice now calm and authoritative. I'm Sheriff Brody, and you're under arrest. The tables had turned. Mrs. Kravitz's eyes widened in disbelief. The color drained from her face. Sheriff, she stammered. But you're just the new neighbor. Brody remained calm, his voice steady and unwavering. That's right, Mrs. Kravitz. I'm also the county sheriff, and I'm placing you under arrest for assault and harassment. He pulled out his handcuffs. Mrs. Kravitz recoiled in horror. You can't do this, she shrieked. I'm the president of the HOA. I have connections. You'll regret this. I doubt that, Mrs. Kravitz, Brody said, his gaze unwavering. You're going to regret your actions today, and for a long time to come. He carefully placed the handcuffs on her wrists. As he led her out of the house, several neighbors emerged from their homes, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. They had clearly witnessed the confrontation and were finally seeing Mrs. Kravitz face the consequences of her actions. One woman, Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door to Mrs. Kravitz, approached Brody, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Sheriff, she said, her voice trembling. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. No one has ever stood up to her before. I'm just doing my job, ma'am, Brody said. But I promise you, things are going to change around here. He led Mrs. Kravitz to his patrol car, which he had deliberately parked a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention to himself. As he placed her in the back seat, she continued to rant and rave, threatening him with lawsuits and vowing to ruin his career. Brody ignored her. He knew that she was just trying to intimidate him, but he wasn't going to let her. He had seen too much suffering in his life to be intimidated by a petty tyrant like Mrs. Kravitz. He drove her to the county jail, where she was booked and processed. As he watched her being led away to her cell, he felt a sense of satisfaction wash over him. He had finally brought Mrs. Kravitz to justice, and he had protected his daughter from her cruelty and hatred. But he knew that this was just the beginning. He still had to deal with the HOA, which had clearly enabled Mrs. Kravitz's behavior. He knew that he had a long fight ahead of him, but he was ready for it. He was the county sheriff, and he wasn't going to let a group of petty suburban tyrants ruin his daughter's life. He was going to fight for her, and he was going to win. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over. He needed to ensure Lily felt safe and loved, and that Willow Creek became a community, not a prison. He hoped other neighbors would be brave enough to speak out. He would make sure they had a safe space to do so. Later that evening, after ensuring Lily was settled and comforted, Brody returned to the sheriff's department. He needed to file the paperwork on Mrs. Kravitz's arrest and begin the investigation. As he sat at his desk, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Kravitz's lawyer. "Sheriff Brody," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and condescending, "I'm representing Patricia Kravitz. I understand you arrested her earlier today." "That's correct," Brody replied, his voice firm. "Well, Sheriff, I think there's been a misunderstanding," the lawyer said. "Mrs. Kravitz assures me that this was all just a big joke. She never intended to harm your daughter in any way." Brody scoffed. "A joke? Shining a laser pointer on a child is not a joke, counselor. It's assault. My client claims she didn't realize your daughter was disabled," the lawyer continued, his tone shifting slightly. "She would never intentionally discriminate against someone with a disability." Brody clenched his fist. "That's a lie," he said. "She made several disparaging remarks about my daughter's condition earlier today. She knew exactly what she was doing." "Well, Sheriff, I'm sure we can sort this all out in court," the lawyer said. "In the meantime, I'm requesting that you release my client immediately." "That's not going to happen," Brody said. "Mrs. Kravitz is going to be held accountable for her actions. I have witnesses who can testify to her behavior, and I have evidence that she deliberately harassed my daughter." "We'll see about that, Sheriff," the lawyer said, his voice now laced with menace. "This isn't over." Brody hung up the phone, his anger simmering once again. He knew that Mrs. Kravitz and her lawyer would try to use every trick in the book to get her off the hook, but he wasn't going to let them. He was going to make sure that she paid for what she had done. The next morning, Brody went to visit Lily. He found her sitting on the porch, looking sad and withdrawn. "Hey, sweetie," Brody said, sitting down beside her. "How are you feeling?" Lily shrugged. "Okay," she said quietly. "But I don't want to put up the Halloween decorations anymore." Brody's heart sank. He knew that Mrs. Kravitz had taken something precious away from Lily, something that she would never get back. "Don't say that, Lily," Brody said, squeezing her hand. "Don't let her win. Don't let her take away your joy. Your decorations are beautiful, and they make a lot of people happy. You shouldn't let one mean person ruin that for you." Lily looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt. "But what if she comes back?" she asked. "What if she tries to hurt me again?" "She's not going to come back, Lily," Brody said, his voice firm. "I promise you, I won't let her. I'm going to make sure that she stays far away from you, and that she never hurts you again." He had to make sure she knew she was safe, even if he was still figuring out how to do that. The investigation was ongoing, but it was personal now. And he would do everything in his power to protect his daughter. He hoped the other neighbors would step up and tell the truth, too. He knew some of them were scared, but he hoped Lily's situation would give them courage. While Mrs. Kravitz was being processed at the jail, Sheriff Brody spoke to the officer in charge. He wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly and that Mrs. Kravitz understood the gravity of her situation. "I want to make it clear that this isn't just about some petty HOA dispute," Brody explained, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Kravitz deliberately targeted a child with a disability and subjected her to harassment and intimidation. Her actions could have had serious psychological consequences for Lily." The officer nodded, his expression grim. "I understand, Sheriff. We'll make sure she understands the seriousness of the charges." Brody then requested to speak to Mrs. Kravitz one last time, before she was placed in her cell. He wanted to make sure she understood the full extent of her wrongdoing. He entered the small, sterile interview room and sat down across from Mrs. Kravitz, who was sitting at the table, her face pale and drawn. She looked much less confident and imposing than she had earlier that day. "Mrs. Kravitz," Brody said, his voice calm and controlled, "I want you to understand the severity of your actions. You didn't just violate some HOA rules. You committed a crime." Mrs. Kravitz remained silent, her eyes fixed on the table. "You deliberately scared and intimidated a child," Brody continued. "You used a laser pointer to shine a red dot on her stomach, knowing that it would frighten her. That's assault, Mrs. Kravitz. And it's a serious offense." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Furthermore," he added, "you made disparaging remarks about Lily's disability, suggesting that she was somehow less worthy because of her condition. That's discrimination, Mrs. Kravitz, and it's unacceptable." Mrs. Kravitz finally looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I didn't mean to scare her," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I just wanted to teach her a lesson." "A lesson?" Brody repeated, his voice incredulous. "What kind of lesson do you think you were teaching her, Mrs. Kravitz? That it's okay to bully and harass people who are different? That it's okay to discriminate against people with disabilities?" Mrs. Kravitz didn't respond. "Your actions were wrong, Mrs. Kravitz," Brody said, his voice firm but compassionate. "And you're going to have to face the consequences. I hope that while you're sitting in that cell, you'll take some time to reflect on what you've done and to think about the harm you've caused to Lily." He stood up and walked towards the door. "This isn't just about the law, Mrs. Kravitz," he said, turning back to face her one last time. "It's about doing what's right. And what you did was wrong. Very wrong." He left the room, leaving Mrs. Kravitz alone with her thoughts. He hoped his words would make a difference, but he wasn't optimistic. He had a feeling that Mrs. Kravitz was too deeply entrenched in her own prejudices and beliefs to change. But he had done his best. Now, it was up to the courts to decide her fate. His focus now was Lily. He needed to find a way to bring back her spirit. He just hoped the neighbors would cooperate. He needed them to come forward. The next few days were a whirlwind. News of Mrs. Kravitz's arrest spread like wildfire throughout Willow Creek. At first, many residents were hesitant to speak out, fearing retaliation from the HOA. But as they saw Sheriff Brody standing firm, as they witnessed his unwavering support for Lily, their courage began to grow. One by one, neighbors started to come forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation at the hands of Mrs. Kravitz. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had thanked Brody at the scene of the arrest, was the first to speak publicly. She recounted how Mrs. Kravitz had repeatedly fined her for minor landscaping infractions, even though she had always followed the HOA rules. "She just didn't like my flower choices," Mrs. Henderson explained, her voice trembling with anger. "She said they were too unconventional. She wanted everything to be uniform and bland, just like her." Another neighbor, Mr. Peterson, shared how Mrs. Kravitz had threatened to evict him for painting his front door a slightly different shade of beige than the one approved by the HOA. "It was the same color, practically," Mr. Peterson said, shaking his head in disbelief. "But she said it was a violation of the community's aesthetic standards. She was a nightmare. A young couple, the Millers, recounted how Mrs. Kravitz had constantly complained about their children playing in the yard, claiming that they were making too much noise and disturbing the peace. She said we needed to keep them under control, Mrs. Miller said, her eyes filled with tears. She said they were ruining the neighborhood. As more and more neighbors came forward, a clear picture began to emerge of Mrs. Kravitz as a petty tyrant who had abused her power for years, using the HOA as a weapon to control and intimidate the residents of Willow Creek. Sheriff Brody listened patiently to each story, taking notes and gathering evidence. He knew that these testimonies would be crucial in building a strong case against Mrs. Kravitz and in exposing the corrupt practices of the HOA. Meanwhile, Lily began to slowly recover from the trauma of the incident. With Brody's encouragement, she started to think about her Halloween decorations again. She even began to sketch out some new designs, inspired by the support she had received from her neighbors. One afternoon, as Lily was working on her drawings, Mrs. Henderson came over with a plate of cookies. "I wanted to thank you for standing up to Mrs. Kravitz," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've given us all the courage to speak out. You're a hero, Lily." Lily smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I just want to decorate for Halloween." Mrs. Henderson laughed. "Well, you're doing a great job," she said. "And I can't wait to see what you come up with next." As Mrs. Henderson left, Lily looked at Brody, her face filled with hope. "Maybe we should put up the decorations again, Dad," she said. "Maybe we should show Mrs. Kravitz that she can't take away our joy." Brody smiled. "That's my girl," he said. "Let's do it." He knew that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that they were on the right track. With the support of their neighbors and with Lily's unwavering spirit, they could overcome anything. The community was starting to heal, thanks to Lily's bravery. He knew that together, they could build a better Willow Creek, a place where everyone felt welcome and valued, regardless of their differences. He would do everything in his power to make that happen. He owed it to Lily, and he owed it to the community. With the growing number of complaints against Mrs. Kravitz and the HOA, Sheriff Brody knew he had to take action beyond just the initial arrest. He couldn't simply let Mrs. Kravitz's actions be dismissed as a personal vendetta or a minor dispute. This was about systemic abuse of power and potential discrimination, and he had a duty to investigate it thoroughly. He officially launched an investigation into Mrs. Kravitz's actions and the HOA's practices, assigning a team of detectives to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and review the HOA's records. He made it clear that no stone should be left unturned and that he wanted to uncover the full extent of the HOA's wrongdoing. "We need to determine whether Mrs. Kravitz acted alone or whether she was acting on behalf of the HOA," Brody told his team. "We need to find out if the HOA's rules and regulations are discriminatory and whether they have been unfairly enforced against certain residents." The investigation quickly revealed a pattern of discriminatory practices within the HOA. The detectives discovered that the HOA had consistently targeted residents who were different in some way, whether it was their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, or their disability. They found evidence that the HOA had imposed stricter fines and penalties on these residents and had subjected them to constant harassment and intimidation. The detectives also uncovered evidence of financial mismanagement within the HOA. They discovered that Mrs. Kravitz had been using HOA funds for her own personal expenses, including lavish vacations and expensive home improvements. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Mrs. Kravitz and the HOA continued to mount. It became clear that Mrs. Kravitz was not just a petty tyrant, but a criminal who had abused her power for personal gain and had deliberately discriminated against vulnerable members of the community. Meanwhile, Lily continued to work on her Halloween decorations, her spirits lifted by the support she had received from her neighbors. She created a special display in her front yard, featuring a sign that read, "Welcome to Willow Creek, where everyone is welcome." She invited all of her neighbors to help her decorate, and soon, the entire neighborhood was transformed into a Halloween wonderland. The houses were adorned with spooky ghosts, grinning pumpkins, and friendly monsters, and the streets were filled with laughter and joy. Even some of the residents who had initially been hesitant to speak out against Mrs. Kravitz joined in the festivities, their faces beaming with happiness. They realized that by standing together, they could overcome anything, even the most oppressive forces. As Brody watched Lily and her neighbors decorating, he felt a sense of hope and optimism. He knew that the fight against Mrs. Kravitz and the HOA was far from over, but he also knew that they were on the right path. By standing together, by speaking out against injustice, and by embracing their differences, they could build a better Willow Creek, a place where everyone felt valued and respected. And that, he knew, was a victory worth fighting for. He just needed to find a way to make sure what Mrs. Kravitz did would never happen again. The legal ramifications would be complicated, but he was determined to make sure justice was served. As the detectives delved deeper into the HOA's records, they uncovered a treasure trove of evidence detailing Mrs. Kravitz's history of harassment. They reviewed countless emails, letters, and meeting minutes, piecing together a timeline of her reign of terror. To illustrate the pattern of abuse, let's look at some specific examples. The case of the purple petunias. Mrs. Garcia, an elderly widow, loved to garden. She had planted a beautiful flower bed in her front yard, filled with colorful petunias. One day, Mrs. Kravitz sent her a notice of HOA violation, claiming that the petunias were the wrong shade of purple. She demanded that Mrs. Garcia remove the flowers immediately or face a hefty fine. Mrs. Garcia was heartbroken. She had spent hours tending to her garden, and she couldn't believe that someone would object to the color of her flowers. In the end, she reluctantly removed the purple petunias, replacing them with approved, but less vibrant, white impatiens. The incident with the holiday lights. Mr. and Mrs. Lee were excited to celebrate their first Christmas in Willow Creek. They decorated their house with festive holiday lights, including a twinkling snowman and a string of colorful icicles. Mrs. Kravitz immediately sent them a notice of HOA violation, claiming that the lights were too bright and distracting. She demanded that they remove the lights immediately or face a daily fine. The Lees tried to reason with Mrs. Kravitz, explaining that they were just trying to spread some holiday cheer, but she wouldn't budge. They were forced to take down their lights, feeling like they had been robbed of their holiday spirit. The saga of the basketball hoop. 10-year-old Timmy Johnson loved to play basketball. His parents had installed a basketball hoop in their driveway so he could practice his shooting skills. Mrs. Kravitz sent them a notice of HOA violation, claiming that the basketball hoop was a safety hazard and a blight on the community's aesthetic. She demanded that they remove the hoop immediately or face legal action. Timmy was devastated. Basketball was his passion, and he couldn't imagine life without it. His parents fought back, arguing that the basketball hoop was harmless and that it provided a healthy outlet for their son. But Mrs. Kravitz refused to back down. They were eventually forced to remove the hoop, leaving Timmy heartbroken and disillusioned. These were just a few examples of the many instances of harassment and intimidation perpetrated by Mrs. Kravitz. The detectives uncovered dozens of similar cases, painting a clear picture of a woman who was obsessed with control and who was willing to do anything to enforce her vision of suburban perfection. Brody reviewed these cases with a growing sense of outrage. He couldn't believe that one person could cause so much pain and suffering. He was determined to bring Mrs. Kravitz to justice and to prevent her from ever hurting anyone again. He also knew they had to find a way to dismantle the HOA and create a more inclusive and welcoming community. The flashbacks helped him understand the depth of the problem and the importance of his mission. He needed to make sure Lily felt safe and happy, and that no other child would ever have to endure what she had gone through. The investigation confirmed what many in Willow Creek had long suspected. Mrs. Kravitz had been abusing her power within the HOA for years, operating with impunity and using her position to settle personal scores and enrich herself. The detectives discovered that she had manipulated the HOA's rules and regulations to target specific residents, often based on petty grievances or personal prejudices. She had imposed exorbitant fines for minor infractions, knowing that many residents couldn't afford to pay them. She had used her influence to block improvements and renovations that she didn't personally approve of. And she had consistently stifled any attempts to challenge her authority or question her decisions. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that Mrs. Kravitz had been using HOA funds as her personal piggy bank. She had charged. The evidence against Mrs. Kravitz was overwhelming. She was formally charged with assault, harassment, discrimination, and embezzlement. The charges carried significant penalties, including jail time and hefty fines. The news of the charges sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. Many residents were overjoyed to see Mrs. Kravitz finally held accountable for her actions. Others were still fearful, wondering what the future held for the HOA and the community. One of the first consequences Mrs. Kravitz faced was her removal from her position as HOA president. The HOA board, under intense pressure from the community and the authorities, voted unanimously to oust her. An interim president was appointed, a kind and fair-minded woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had been one of Mrs. Kravitz's most vocal critics. Mrs. Henderson immediately pledged to reform the HOA, to make it more transparent, more democratic, and more inclusive. She promised to review all of the HOA's rules and regulations, to eliminate any discriminatory practices, and to ensure that all residents were treated fairly and with respect. Meanwhile, Mrs. Kravitz lawyered up and prepared for a long and difficult legal battle. She continued to maintain her innocence, claiming that she had been unfairly targeted and that her actions had been misinterpreted. But as the trial approached, the evidence against her became increasingly damning. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including emails, letters, meeting minutes, and financial records, all of which pointed to Mrs. Kravitz's guilt. They also called numerous witnesses, including Lily and several other Willow Creek residents, who testified about Mrs. Kravitz's abusive behavior. The trial was a media circus, attracting attention from local and national news outlets. The story of the HOA Karen, who had terrorized her neighbors and discriminated against a disabled child, resonated with people across the country. In the end, the jury found Mrs. Kravitz guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to several years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to her victims. The verdict brought a sense of closure to Willow Creek. The residents had finally been freed from Mrs. Kravitz's reign of terror, and they could begin to rebuild their community, to create a place where everyone felt welcome and valued. For Lily, the verdict was a vindication. She had stood up to a bully, and she had won. She had shown the world that even the most powerful and intimidating people can be brought to justice. And she had inspired others to speak out against injustice and to fight for what's right. The HOA was on the verge of being dismantled, and Lily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since moving into Willow Creek. It was time to move on and rebuild. The community was ready, and so was she. She could finally focus on her Halloween decorations without fear or anxiety. She wanted to make this year's celebration the best one yet, a symbol of hope and renewal for Willow Creek. The next step was making that happen. With Mrs. Kravitz behind bars and the HOA undergoing significant reforms, Willow Creek began a period of healing and transformation. The community was determined to create a more inclusive and welcoming environment for everyone, especially those with disabilities. Mrs. Henderson, the interim HOA president, spearheaded several initiatives to promote accessibility and understanding. She organized a series of community workshops on disability awareness, inviting experts to educate residents on the challenges faced by people with disabilities and how to create a more inclusive environment. She also worked with Lily and Sheriff Brody to identify areas in the neighborhood that were not accessible to people with wheelchairs and other mobility devices. Together, they developed a plan to make the necessary modifications, including installing ramps, widening sidewalks, and creating accessible parking spaces. The residents of Willow Creek embraced these changes with enthusiasm. They volunteered their time and resources to help with the accessibility projects, demonstrating their commitment to creating a truly inclusive community. One neighbor, Mr. Peterson, who had previously been harassed by Mrs. Kravitz for painting his front door the wrong shade of beige, offered to build a ramp for Lily's house. He spent weeks. With Halloween just around the corner, Lily was more determined than ever to create the most spectacular display Willow Creek had ever seen. This time, however, she wouldn't be doing it alone. Inspired by Lily's courage and creativity, her neighbors rallied around her, offering their help and support. Mr. Peterson, the ramp builder, volunteered to construct a giant, wheelchair-accessible haunted house in Lily's front yard. Mrs. Garcia, the purple petunia enthusiast, offered to create a whimsical flower garden filled with spooky blooms. The Miller children, who had previously been banned from playing in their yard, eagerly helped Lily decorate with ghosts, goblins, and ghouls. Even Sheriff Brody got in on the act, using his carpentry skills to build a life-sized replica of a sheriff's station, complete with a jail cell for Mrs. Kravitz, in effigy, of course. Together, they transformed Lily's front yard into a Halloween wonderland, a testament to the power of community and the triumph of good over evil. The decorations were bigger, bolder, and more imaginative than anything Lily had ever dreamed of. There was a graveyard filled with tombstones bearing humorous epitaphs, a haunted forest with creepy creatures lurking behind every tree, and a pumpkin patch with pumpkins of all shapes and sizes. There was even a wheelchair-accessible trick-or-treating zone, where children of all abilities could safely collect candy. On Halloween night, the case of Mrs. Kravitz and the Willow Creek HOA had shone a spotlight on the dark side of homeowners associations and the potential for abuse and discrimination. Sheriff Brody knew that this was not an isolated incident and that countless other communities across the country were facing similar problems. He decided to use his position as county sheriff to advocate for stricter laws against HOA abuse and discrimination. He spoke at town hall meetings, gave interviews to the media, and testified before state legislative committees, sharing his experiences and urging lawmakers to take action. Homeowners associations can be a valuable tool for maintaining property values and promoting community standards, Brody said, but they should never be allowed to become instruments of oppression and discrimination. We need to ensure that HOAs are accountable, transparent, and fair, and that they respect the rights and dignity of all residents. Brody proposed several specific reforms, including mandatory training for HOA board members to ensure that board members understand their responsibilities and are aware of the laws and regulations governing HOAs. Stricter limits on HOA fees and fines to prevent HOAs from imposing exorbitant financial burdens on residents. Increased transparency in HOA finances to ensure that HOA funds are used responsibly and for the benefit of the entire community. Protection for residents with disabilities to prevent HOAs from discriminating against people with disabilities and to ensure that they have equal access to housing and community amenities. A streamlined process for resolving HOA disputes to provide residents with a fair and efficient way to challenge HOA decisions. Brody's advocacy efforts gained widespread support from residents, community leaders, and lawmakers. Several states passed legislation based on his proposals, strengthening protections for homeowners and cracking down on HOA abuse. He also worked with national organizations to raise awareness about HOA issues and to promote best practices for HOA management. He became a sought-after speaker and consultant, sharing his expertise with communities across the country. Brody's work had a profound impact on the landscape of HOA law and policy. He helped to create a more just and equitable system, one that protected the rights of homeowners and prevented the kind of abuse and discrimination that had plagued Willow Creek. And for Lily, Brody's advocacy was another sign of his unwavering love and support. She knew that her dad was not just a sheriff, but a champion for justice and a voice for the voiceless. She was incredibly proud of him, and she knew that together, they could make a difference in the world. The fight wasn't just for her anymore, it was for everyone who had ever been mistreated by a power-hungry HOA. He knew this was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. The community was transformed, but the laws needed to be changed to protect others from similar abuse. He owed it to Lily, and to everyone who had suffered in silence for so long. He wouldn't let them down. Years later, Willow Creek was a completely different place. The HOA, now led by Mrs. Henderson, was a model of fairness and transparency. The community was diverse and welcoming, and everyone felt valued and respected. Lily, now a teenager, was thriving. She had become a local celebrity, known for her creativity, her kindness, and her unwavering spirit. She continued to decorate for every holiday, her displays becoming more elaborate and imaginative each year. She had also become a passionate advocate for disability rights, speaking at schools and community events, sharing her story, and inspiring others to embrace their differences. She had even started a non-profit organization to provide support and resources for children with disabilities and their families. Sheriff Brody continued to serve as the county sheriff, but he was also known as the HOA reformer, a title he wore with pride. He continued to advocate for stricter laws and policies to protect homeowners from abuse and discrimination, and he remained a tireless champion for justice and equality. One sunny afternoon, Brody and Lily were sitting on their porch, enjoying a glass of lemonade. Lily was working on her designs for the upcoming Christmas decorations, her face glowing with excitement. "Dad," she said, looking up at Brody with a smile, "I was thinking, this year, we should do a Christmas around the world theme. We could have decorations from different countries, representing different cultures and traditions." Brody smiled. "That's a great idea, sweetie," he said. "I think that would be a wonderful way to celebrate the diversity of our community." Lily grinned. "I know," she said. "And maybe we could even get some of our neighbors to help us. Mrs. Garcia could make some traditional Mexican ornaments, and the Lees could make some Chinese lanterns." Brody chuckled. "I think that's a fantastic idea," he said. "I'm sure everyone would love to get involved." They sat in silence for a moment, enjoying the peace and quiet of their transformed neighborhood. The air was filled with the sounds of children playing, birds singing, and neighbors chatting. It was a perfect day, in a perfect community. Brody looked at Lily, his heart